He's
No,
fine.
I
It is
thought he was
my
gonna
distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Roberta Klatsky. She's the Charles J. McQueen, Charles J. Queenan, Jr., Professor of Psychology and the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. Everybody calls her Bobby, so I'll just call her Bobby. I've had the great pleasure of working with Bobby over the past 15 years on a large number of psychophysical investigations of haptics, which has been terrific. Bobby received a BS in mathematics from the University of Michigan, PhD in cognitive psychology from Stanford. Her research investigates perception, spatial thinking, and action from the perspective of multiple modalities, such as haptic, vision, and so forth, sensory and symbolic, in both real and virtual environments. And her research has been applied to telemanipulation, image-guided surgery, navigation aids for the blind, and neurorehabilitation. So over the years, she's gained a lot of accolades. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They're trying to get me to join that. Fellow of the American Psychological Association, fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, and fellow of the IEEE. And she's an honorary member of the Society of Experimental Psychologists. For a couple of years ago, for her work on perception and action, she received the Alexander von Humboldt Research Award and the Kurt Kofta Medal from Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. So she's had a number of professional service roles as well in a number of committees of the National Academy of Science on international psychology, human factors, reducing counterfeiting, using behavioral sciences, and techniques for enhancing human performance, and on it goes. Okay. So we're happy to have Bobby here. Let's give Bobby a big welcome.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you all for coming. Okay, well, gee, thank you for that introduction. I have had such a great time working with Ralph over the years, and I'm going to talk a lot about his device and what we've done with it. But I'm actually going to start very basic, talking about what it means to be, talking about material properties and what is not a material property, and then I'm going to give you some biology, because it's my belief that you can't really design rendering algorithms without knowing something about the biological system that you're actually designing them for. And then I'll give you some examples of how we've used this approach to render texture, rendering compliance and stiffness, and if we have time, some complex interactions that you can go further with. So what's a material property and what is not? If you look in a material science text, you're likely to find some kind of basic distinction between structural properties of objects and material properties. And the biggest difference is that the geometric or structural properties describe a specific sample, regardless of the material from which it's made. And you can try to describe it, for example, with some sort of algorithm that has fits a structure to it, or you can have metrics for size. Material properties, on the other hand, are applying to arbitrary samples, just the reverse. And they're things like the surface properties of roughness and friction, or compliance, or thermal conductivity. So vision and touch in biological systems have evolved actually to have different specializations in these two domains. And so vision is really what we use for structural properties, even as the little infant is going to try to bring things to the eyes, and then occasionally as they move along to the mouth for oral haptic exploration. Material properties, on the other hand, are highly accessible to the sense of touch and rather limited with vision, which is why when we want to know if we've sanded a surface properly, we rub it with our fingers rather than just looking at it. And if we are very savvy and clever and have the right devices, we can actually render material properties to touch by algorithms and devices, and that's what I really want to concentrate on. So I'm going to start with the biology and how you get to material properties through the sense of touch. And then I'm going to move on to ask the question of whether people can perceive material through a tool, which is essential to most of the ways that material properties are rendered. You're usually not touching them with your bare skin, but with some kind of tool-type interface. So here is what sits underneath the skin of your fingers, for example, the so-called glabrous skin. There's a lot of stuff under there. And in particular, on the left, we're seeing 4 mechanical receptor types, two of which are fairly close to the surface of the skin and have what we say as small receptive fields, that is very good resolution or acuity. And 2 deeper ones which don't do resolving as well. And the other big difference between them is whether they like steady state stimulation and won't adapt, or whether they like time variant information, in which case you have to jitter them. In other words, you have to vibrate the skin. So this deep receptor, the Pacinian corpuscle, or the so-called rapidly adapting type 2, is what you feel on your cell phone, for example, and that rattles it quite heavily when you're getting that vibration. This is beautiful work from Johansson and Westling, where they actually had to grab a particular neuron underneath the skin and see what the properties were of whatever was driving it. They couldn't go down into the finger and actually look at the receptor itself, but they were able to characterize the density on the fingers and palms of these different kinds of neural population, and one sees that they differ according to whether they're on the fingertip or on other parts of the hand. So that was the 70s, and it became known as the 4-channel model for touch because of the combination of these different receptor types and their characteristics. And then in the 1980s, I actually began working with Susan Lederman, my longtime collaborator, and we asked, what does action add to the characteristics or to the capabilities of these receptor populations? And what we found was that people and a lot of lower animals, including even seals and whiskered animals, mice, monkeys, and so on, who have comparable receptor populations, adapt their actions so as to optimally stimulate the receptors. And so when you want to find out, for example, about surface properties like roughness or slipperiness, you run your fingers laterally across the surface of the finger, and what that is doing is optimally stimulating the receptors that are going to be reading that particular information. And in this case, we'll discover there are 2 different families of receptors that you're stimulating with this kind of feeling. And if you want to know about the pressure or the compliance of a surface, you will try to deform it against resisting pressure. So moving on from what Susan and I did, people asked, well, gee, why does this occur? And a lot of nice models have been built to explain why activity combined with receptor activity, so human motion combined with receptor activity, leads to a knowledge about properties, both material and structural. So here we have what happens when you're feeling the surface roughness of some kind of surface. You have your finger moving along the variations in the surface, and it's going over some kind of position. Spatial position is changing, and so it's changing over time. And so what it shows you here, if you were going along a nice sinusoidal texture, your finger would be basically moving, feeling the texture amplitude as you moved in your position. And then you can think of this, if you are thinking in terms of looking at the spectral properties, you can have a series of running windows to say what is the spectrum underneath that, and if it were in fact a sine, you would just recover the sine period for that particular texture, and so the Fourier magnitude would peak at the wavelength in which the texture is actually varying. And when it's more complex, you'll pick up multiple spectral signatures for the same texture. But in this kind of model, as you run your finger along the surface, as you vary in space, you're also varying in time. So people have asked, what matters? Is it the variation in the temporal signal, or is it the variation in the spatial signal? And the answer is that time and space both matter. So here is the case for space, and I've circled the Merkel cell complexes up there. They're the slowly adapting type 1 receptor that's close to the surface of the skin. And as you run and I'm going to talk about surfaces that are bunches of dots. So they're like raised conical elements like you see up there. And as you run along them, the tendency is to feel dense dot textures as smooth and sparse dot textures as rough. And so you could ask people to actually rate subjective roughness, which is what is shown on the y-axis of these plots. And then you can also measure the responses of receptors and say what tracks them. And what you see here is that the best track, in fact, is the variability in the SA1 or the Merkel cell complex receptor populations. And it's a variability in terms of the distribution of pressure over space. It's like they take a map of their pressure distribution, say how much is it varying over space, and that map is computed in the brain coming up from those receptors, and that gives rise to this feeling of, or the subjective impression of roughness. If you try to play the same game with the receptor populations that are temporally sensitive, you don't get nearly as good a signal. And so for coarse textures on the order of a millimeter or so in spacing, the answer is space matters. And in fact, these are invariant to the speed with which you move your finger. Well, that's true of the next population as well. If you now look what happens for very finely grained surfaces, you'll find a different story. Now time matters. So here's a plate with very small raised elements. You can see there, and part of the plate is textured and part of it is not. And as you move it along, these slowly adapting receptors, which were so sensitive to the coarse texture, are basically just giving you signal all the time. But the two rapidly adapting populations, particularly the deep ones, the Pacinian corpuscles, those very deep blue ones up there that I have, well, they're not colored blue in your body, but in my graph they're blue. So those two, that population down there, and that other one is the RAs that are near the surface, those actually differentiate the two parts of the plate very well. You're feeling the first part of the plate that's coming towards you is textured, and the next part is perfectly smooth. So these are micron level textures, and they're linked to the temporally varying signal. Again, it doesn't matter how fast or slow you move, which is a kind of an interesting mystery that people are still pursuing. So it's all in the timing. If you look, in fact, at the spectral signal of different materials, so here we have these, with a laser Doppler vibrometer, you can actually measure the vibration on the skin as you run your finger over a material. You can get the spectrum for that, and then you can look at the spectrum of the firing rates for these Pacinian corpuscles. So what these PCs do, as neurons are prone to do, they go rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat, and they send spikes. But in this case, they actually entrain to the temporal variation in the surface that you're feeling. And so the very same vibrations on the skin that are setting up a spectral pattern for a particular material are causing the Pacinians to fire at the same rate. And you see this beautiful coupling of the Pacinian firing rate with the skin vibration rate that tells you this is a very beautiful time varying signal that's being used to get these textures. And these are relatively fine textures once again. So to summarize, it's all in the receptors, how you explore them, and then what the algorithm does. I haven't mentioned the receptors in your skin muscles, sorry, in your muscles, tendons, and joints. That comprises what's called your kinesthetic system. But those are used for what I'll talk about later, which is not texture, but rather the compliance of a material as you squeeze, press, twist, or apply pressure. But otherwise, this table basically tells you that different populations of receptors, even with the very same way that you explore, have different material properties that are delivered from different algorithms. Now, what about a tool? What happens to the system when we're interacting through a rigid tool, like a probe, a stick type probe? Well, tools take away one of the most important aspects of skin sensing, which is the distribution of pressure over the surface that's sensed by the slowly adapting mechanoreceptors, particularly the SA1s or the Merkel cell complexes. Because what you're doing is you're holding onto the tool. You're not, in fact, whatever you're getting in terms of pressure variation is from the tool, not from the underlying surface. So that's gone. And so you'll no longer be able to tell whether something is arrayed along your finger or across your finger, but you still get temporal varying signals from the interaction between the surface and the tool. And so you can potentially get texture from vibration, you can get compliance by pushing, you can get viscosity, friction, stick slip, and so on. And can you indeed do that? Well, yes, you can. Here's what happens when you feel jittered conical textures with different degrees of spacing between the elements with a stick type probe and with a sphere on the end of it. And what you find is that your perceived roughness first grows as the spacing gets wider and then shrinks again. Why does this happen? Well, we modeled it by describing it as the transition from the probe riding along the surface and being jittered a lot to falling down to the substrate and basically just tapping the elements as it goes by. So at first it jitters more. As the elements really widen up relative to the probe tip, it drops down between, and now you're no longer really riding on that surface at all. So there is a peak in it, just as the vibration, as you're going over the bumpy road and you're still on the road, as the vibration gets really big, that's where you have peak roughness. And what you see there is that the finger kind of acts like a probe with a very large tip. And that's important because it tells you that the finger is itself kind of an exploratory unit. And so, but it also tells you that with a tool, you get some surrogate for surface roughness that the finger would otherwise be feeling directly. Well, most haptic devices act like tools. This is the Butterfly Haptics magnetic levitation device that was developed by someone we know well, Ralph. And it's nice that we can perceive with tools because, in fact, this simulates a tool. And I want to say here that we can both validate the device and find something about the human by doing some nice, careful psychophysical experiments. And that's what I'm going to move on to next, using not only the maglev, but other devices to render the textural property of roughness. Or maybe it's not roughness, but that's what we'll call it. So one of the beauties of a device like this is you can do something that would cost you many, many thousands of dollars to do without it, which is to create virtual environments with quite stiff elements of different shapes, sizes, and spatial distributions. And for many years, Susan and I, and Susan before me, did in fact photographic engraving techniques. We would send away for maybe 20 plates and we would get a bill back for $2,000 or so. And this was at a time when $2,000 was a lot of money. And so now we're able to, on the fly, dial up textures with these properties as long as we adopt the constraint that we're feeling them with a tool type interface. And we can actually do things like zeroing in on the just noticeable difference, which you could not possibly do with photo engraving. You'd have to have so many plates with fine gradations. And we can look at perceived roughness magnitude, and we can compare the results to humans. So now I will turn to Bert Unger's thesis, which Ralph supervised a number of years ago, and I interacted with Bert very closely on his experimental work. And Bert developed what he called the constraint surface algorithm to describe the maglev's behavior with a virtual surface. So he modeled it as a probe with a spherical tip, and as you push down into the surface, depending on its depth, it pushed back in some degree toward you. And so it actually generated a counterforce proportional to the depth of penetration of the surface. The probe itself was always maintained as a vertical thing marching along the surface, and when it went above the surface, it was just subject to the constraints of gravity. So if you look at what the behavior is of the hand and what the hand is getting under this, here we have a person moving the probe along one of these virtual surfaces. They're moving along the X. There's a little bit of motion along the Y. And so you see here the purple is the X and the red is the Y. And that's from the voluntary movement of the person as they're exploring the surface. The little black line is what is being imposed by the constraint surface interaction algorithm with these underlying population of jittered cones that is being modeled. And now we can very carefully ask what leads to the perception of surface roughness. Well, we we have people explore surfaces with different spacing. We usually keep dot element height the same, but the average spacing between the elements is varied, and as we do that, we'll get changes in the kinematics of the behavior. The velocity will change, the acceleration will be changed. And here we have their subjective roughness magnitude against these kinematic parameters, where each point is just a different surface with a different spacing on it. And there are lots of surfaces here, which you could never do with photo engraving. And what you see here is pretty lousy fits. You know, nothing is being explained by the raw kinematics of the behavior. So what does explain it beautifully is the total power in the spectrum. So the more power in the spectrum, the rougher the surface seems to be. And this works for a broad range of spatial variations that in fact cross the boundary between what's usually thought between spatial on the large side down to temporal on the small side if you were exploring with the finger. But you can see how tight that power fit is to the perceived roughness of the signal. So on the one hand, you can say that we have validated this as a device that's beautifully, elegantly able to create different surfaces. We also have found out something about is causing the human to perceive a surface as rough or not when explored with this kind of a tool. But what about torque? Under the constrained surface algorithm, the tool is always held vertically, and this is what Saba Pedram, a student of Peter Berkelman, who is a student of Ralph, so it's sort of like the grand descendant, called stiff torque. And in fact, he was interested in what happens when you actually allow torque to happen as it happens in the real world. So when you feel a surface with a tool, you actually get torque on your hand as well as the force of penetration. And so here is Peter's device. It's not nearly as pretty as the maglev, but it has in fact quite a few different coils on it, and you can explore it. It bounces you around with a probe you can mount on your finger. You can also hold it in your hand. We tried different ones of these, and here we're simulating a 3D texture that's sinusoidal in two dimensions. And I won't show you the actual data from the roughness experiment, but I will show you the flavor of what it means to have torque variation. In this case, the magnet is used to push the probe tip around so that it always stays perpendicular to the local surface orientation. So you add, in fact, this extra component of torque. And you can see this torque around the axis through the screen. And these are surfaces with different periods of spatial variation. So it's working. In other words, it's generating torque variations. And our experimental data show that when you add the torque signal, in fact, you will enhance the variations and also heighten perceived roughness. So now the tip is not only being pushed back, but actually being rotated so as to produce torque. It is possible to render textures that are virtual textures with direct skin contact, and I've actually been working with Ed Colgate and Mike Peshkin, who were in fact pioneers with a piezoelectric version of this particular approach. And what it does is shake a surface ultrasonically and create a modulation in the friction by a squeeze film effect. And so what really happens is if you feel the glass surface on your phone, well, mine is usually pretty dirty, so it's also sticky, but if you clean your phone very assiduously and you feel it, it's pretty heavy friction. You don't just slide along the darn thing, right? And when you add friction, you actually release, when you add piezoelectric shaking, you release that friction, and you can actually get a nice variation in the friction. And what you want to do here, since it's very small gradations, it's not great big asperities in the surface like we did with the tool, you want to be really stimulating those, probably the Pacinian corpuscles, but possibly also the surface rapidly adapting temporally sensitive receptors. But you basically are looking for a temporally varying signal here. So, gee, now you're using the finger. And so Dave Meyer, a student of Ed and Mike's, asked, well, how is the finger sampling the surface? And so he created these friction surfaces. They have actually no real height variations. They just have a friction gradient on them. And he created variations in texture with a particular spectral mix. On the left here, we have no gaps. And on the right, we have periods in which the resident friction of the plate is just there, or an average friction, actually, I think is what is rendered there. Now, if you look at the spectral properties, it really depends on how big your window is. If you have a large window, what you're going to be doing is mixing all these spectra together in a single sample. And as you can see, that's this middle blue and yellow. You'll just get a kind of big smear because the spectral signals are very similar for the two parts of the plate. On the other hand, if you have a small window, then you'll be able to see that you have a continuous spectrum on the left, but you have interruptions of the varying spectrum on the right. And so you'll start to see local texture variations. So what Dave Meyer did was just keep reducing the size of the gaps until he found the point where the finger itself was too large a spectral window to be able to ambiguate the surface. So the task here was which side of the plate has the gaps in it, and they could be large gaps or small gaps. And what you do is you start with very clearly discernible gaps, and you keep shrinking them down until you get to the point where you can't tell them anymore, and that's this adaptive threshold technique. And what he found was around 0.25 millimeter gaps were kind of the minimum size that the finger could detect, which means that the finger as a Fourier sampling mechanism really can't window below that point.
Can I ask questions while you're moving?
Yeah, sure.
So the entire screen is either shaking or not.
Yep.
You're not shaking individual parts of the screen.
Nope, but it's measuring your position.
And so it's measuring position using its whatever.
It's got optical sensor.
It's finding the center of mass of this thing and calling.
Yeah, there's the trick of what you call the finger or not. Yep.
So it's not really it's not a texture, a spatial texture at any given moment in time.
Yeah.
It's just turning on.
You have to say that this is modulo the resolution of the display, so you can look it up. This is the TPAD, and it's certainly, at least we can say the combination of your finger and the rendering properties of the display.
The display knows where you are with better resolution than that.
Yeah, exactly.
But still, it's odd because it's not that's not a
well, it's the magic of it is the whole thing is on or off, right? And I can show you other data that this becomes problematic if you go away from texture domain and go into pattern domain. Think about trying to create an edge across the whole plate. It will decide to shake when you're at some point on the edge, but the whole plate is shaking, so you're either on it or you're off. There is no gradient at the edge, and those are it's much more problematic device for that domain than it is for the textural domain. Yeah. So when you have the ability then to feel small differences, you can actually create gradients across a pretty small space on the display. So this is work that I did with Hong Tan and my students, and Seung-Moon Choi in Korea. And what we did was we created these friction gradients in a small area of the display and asked people whether they went right or left. And people were very, very good at that. For those of you who know signal detection theory, this is 2.5 standard deviations from the left, from the increasing and the right, the increasing and the decreasing distributions. And that lays open the possibility that even with a tiny swath of a glass plate, you could create something like a tangible slider that people might not have to look at in order to know which way they were moving, which is kind of cool. When I presented this in Germany, the BMW people kind of hung around my poster wondering whether they could replace knobs and dials or use this kind of technique for their plates on, they're trying to move toward tablet computers in the car. But there are quite a few cool applications one could think of for this sort of effect. So that's texture. What about compliance? I'll move on to the surface, another material property, which is stiffness. And the first question is, how does the human feel the softness or stiffness of a surface? And there are, hey Howie, there are two basic types of cues. There are cutaneous cues, which are the same receptors I talked about before, but they basically give way pretty quickly when you push into a surface that's hard enough for your finger to bottom out. So the main signals are really from the kinesthetic system, the force that disturbs muscles and tendons and joint receptors. And what you're looking for is then the time variation and position variation signal in that as you try to apply a force. So the first question then is, can we use tools for this? Because obviously the trick for haptic rendering is to try to use a tool. And this is a nice experiment by Bob Lamotte in which people just rank ordered materials according to their softness when pressing with a finger or a stylus. And you can see they came up with essentially the same solutions with one little perturbation there at the matrix when they were pressing with the stylus. And the tool and the stylus behave very, very quickly, whether you're tapping them or pressing continuously. So this says, hey, tools are very nice for conveying these, that particular material property. So let's look at how that works. So one of the more interesting things in this domain is stiffness, because stiffness is actually a property of material that requires two parameters. You don't just get it from one. You have to ask, what is the resisting force after I've moved a distance? And if you think that a material is behaving like Hooke's law, there's no guarantee it will behave like Hooke's law, but if you think it's like Hooke's law, or you think that the brain expects Hooke's law to be obtained, then in theory, it will get position information and force information from these kinesthetic mechanoreceptors, do the appropriate little bit of algebra, and come up with the stiffness of the surface. And in fact, you really shouldn't have to compress a spring except to a single point in order to know what the resisting force is and the distance is at that point. And that should be enough for you to get stiffness out of your estimate. You might get a more stable estimate or a more reliable estimate by sampling other locations, but you don't really need them. So we can ask, is this a good model of the human who's exploring a spring? And we can use the stiffness of the haptic device to answer this question. So this is work with Bing Wu using, again, the maglev, but now in his lab at Arizona State. And what we came up with was a cool thing that you can find in the physical world, but is relatively easy to render on the maglev, a nonlinear spring. A devious spring that changes its stiffness as you move along it. And so now there are moment-to-moment or position-to-position variations in the stiffness parameter. And we can ask, are people sensitive to these variations, or are they basically still reading from a single location? And so in our experiment, people were induced to move the spring along a trajectory that was bounded by this little circle in the circle. And then they rated the stiffness relative to a fixed modulus, a linear spring. And they said what the ratio was. So with this, we did lots of spring profiles. So the first one just shows you a full sine in the modulation. So the straight line is a linear spring, and in the upward modulation, positive modulation, it's stiffer at the beginning and then kind of crosses over and ends up less stiff at the end, right? De-stiffenifies, I guess you could say, in the middle. That's a technical word. And then, but it's always increasing in the force. So there's never a reversal of the force. And the negative modulation, it just wimps at the beginning, gets stronger, and then straightens itself out again. And then we also tried half sine versions of it. And it's interesting, in the one on the left, the work is the same. That's the total amount of, force produced. And then here is the full experimental variations, different values of stiffness, the different modulation profiles around them. And in each case, people felt one of these springs, and then they gave us as the ratio to modulus how stiff they thought it was. So were they sensitive to the nonlinearity in the spring? The answer is yes, in a kind of unexpected way. Here we have the values of linear stiffness on the x-axis and the reported stiffness on the y-axis. And what you see is that it is in fact modulated by the nonlinearity, but peculiarly the direction of the modulation relative to whether it's first positive and then negative and so on is reversed for the half sine wave profile and the full sine wave profile. So the red line is the negatively modulated spring where it kind of wimps at the beginning, and that's actually giving you a stronger signal in the full sine wave and a weaker signal in the half sine wave. So Bing and I puzzled over this for quite a while, and my friend and longtime colleague, George will know this, has a wonderful way of saying, Bobby, you're wrong. But we went both directions for quite a while, and we finally came up with a really nice Bayesian model that does in fact predict these results very, very well. And it's a Bayesian model in which it says you are continuously modifying a parameter estimate of the spring. So it's like a Kalman filter, I guess. So at any time step you come in with your current reading, and you have the knowledge of the time, of the force at that particular time. And then you move a d, you get a new force, and that exponent on there, 1.4, comes from the literature, so it's not even a parameter that we assigned ourselves. And then we compute a new value of k, and now we have our old value of k that we came in the door with. We have our new reading based just on this little local force displacement. And what we're going to do is update, and we have, this is where the sort of the Bayesianness of it comes in. We weight the importance of the new information relative to the old. We downgrade it if it's really discrepant, because we don't like to shift very much. This is a property of any good evolutionary system. Don't take too big a step at any one time. But we also, if we have a very stable, low standard deviation of our previous estimates, we also weight them more. But if we have a high standard deviation, we say we trust the new information because it's crap going in, so we might as well trust the new information that just came in. And when we fit our one parameter, we can model all of our springs with this. And the reason that the spring trajectory matters and the different shapes matter is because early versus late changes how your parameter estimation is used here. As you go along, you have a more stable estimation. And so these reflect, and there are also points of more or less sudden change, and these are all accounted for in this nice Bayesian model. So I have time to tell you the rest of my story, which is moving on to render even more complex interactions. And Vanitha Varadharan in Ralph's lab did a nice simulation of complex behavior of springs on the maglev with buckling and things like that. But I want to focus on another study that we did, again with the maglev, where with George's group, George Stetton's group, and we modeled complex interactions in the form of puncture of biological materials. So we did this in the context of a grant from the Eye Institute, where in fact we were trying to look at the forces of interaction, figure out when people would know when they might in fact be on the point of puncture. So what we did was simulate with the maglev. I've never had anybody quite faint when they looked at this picture, but you know, some of you may want to look away. But we asked subjects to puncture a simulated membrane and skid as little on the far side. So once you've gone through, stop. That was our instructions. We're trying to stop as quickly as possible. And we used a very simple membrane model. So here is how it works. On one side of the membrane, freely, they're in a low viscous environment. On the far side, they're again in a low viscous environment. And in the membrane, they're in a region with high viscosity and a simulated spring. So they press against this, and the spring parameter is varied, and that's going to give us the variable in our experiment. And once they go through, their job is to break to a 0 point as quickly as possible. So we modeled this as a combination of physical and neurological processes. At the moment of breakthrough, it's just pure physics. You've got a force, the force is released, and there you are, you're accelerating, right? And you have an inertial mass to deal with, and that's built into the device. And, but as you start to sense the fact that you've gone through the membrane, your brain kicks in and it says, stop. And that initiates a braking mechanism that has a neural trajectory that we can actually predict as well. So we modeled the kinematics of, I don't know, on the order of thousands of these interactions. When we recovered the inertial mass of the device, we recovered the time constant of a decay that comes from the muscle and soft tissue, which is passive decline of the velocity, and then we also modeled the point at which the brain kicked in and disrupted this smooth decline process. So once again, once we break, the breakthrough itself causes passive exponential force decay due to the muscle and soft tissue that's involved, plus the brain kicks in and causes a sudden perturbation. So our model makes these kinds of prediction after the burst, and on the left, on the y-axis here is the distance that you go. You're thrust through, and you're going to go some trajectory that's just due to the force you broke through on, and also the passive exponential decline that's built into our model. And if you have a very slow force decay, it'll look like that upper function, and if you have faster force decay, it'll look like those lower functions. And those are depending on the membrane stiffness as you went through. But when the brain kicks in, you start deviating from the model, and that's what's shown on the right-hand side. So the model predicts a very smooth decline in your velocity until you finally come to a stop. But the brain says, nay, I'm going to add to the process and get out of here. And so we can actually spot, by fitting the model, we can spot that point in which we start to deviate. And that was one of the things that we measured. In fact, the stronger the membrane is in terms of the stiffness of that internal spring, the faster you deviate from the passive model, because the signal to your brain is much stronger. You go through a stiff membrane, and your brain knows it a lot more than when you go through a wimpy membrane. And so that actually comes up, and these are just the two directions of interaction with the membrane. So the point at which you deviate from a purely passive model, indicating that your brain has sensed something and started to make a difference, is increasing the stronger the sensory signal, and the sensory signal is stronger when the membrane itself is stiffer. On the other hand, on the same trajectory here. So here we have your breakthrough force on the x-axis, which is totally determined by the model and the k-factor that's in the membrane itself. Your breakthrough acceleration, as we can measure, and we see this nice linear function. All the physics is behaving as it should be. On this side, we have the time that it actually took you to break. And again, the time that it took you to break is going to be longer because it's shorter when the membrane is stiffer, because you got that perceptual signal sooner. So really stiff membrane, your brain turned on very fast and actually brought you to a stop faster than with a weaker membrane. So the lessons learned from all of this are that you can render material properties on haptic devices. I think that the wonderful approach to this is to adapt the device to the biology of the human perceiver, so that we know something about what we're actually trying to create in the human who is supposed to get the results of the rendering. And we can also model, well, point 3, I think, is the same. Let's understand that biology so we know how to deliver a signal that the brain can actually use. And finally, we can push this into relatively complex interactions that we can still model on very fundamental principles of physics and biology. So with that, I'd just like to thank a lot of people who have been influential and instrumental in this work. And it's exactly the time to ask you for questions. Yes?
So during the puncture test, when they had to stop as soon as they felt that they had gone through, did you do any sort of controls for like where they had to stop, and did you notice any?
Yeah, we actually modeled that too. That's kind of the sadder part of this story, because they stopped sooner, but they went further because their velocity was greater. So what one of those trajectories really looks like is this. Push, push, and there are these little oscillations at the end of it. We even were able to model the first and second oscillations. Then the data got too sparse, but we could show that the stiffer the membrane was, that signal was still there in the first and second oscillations as you tried to get to the 0 point. So we went into a lot more detail than I just presented. So the real story is stiff membrane, early signal, early deviation, faster slowdown, but still, sorry, this is life, this is physics. You end up skidding further. Yep.
Just to follow up on that, was natural tremor a part of that post-breakthrough?
That's a great question. First of all, because they're pushing against something stiff, it's kind of stabilizing them, and also the tremor signal is slow enough that all of this kind of progressed probably within a window of tremor. I think tremor is around 6 hertz or so, so that would be pretty slow for this braking task.
I'm also intrigued by the puncture task. If I were to make a robot do it, and I had a 100 millisecond or 50 millisecond time delay, I'd actually not use any sensing information. Instead, I'd generate a push of a certain duration. If that didn't puncture, I'd generate a push of a slightly larger duration.
Yeah.
Did any subjects do anything like that? And if not, why not?
It's too slow. I mean, you're servoing, so it's even worse because you're fine because you can stop on a dime, but the human can't, if you know what I mean. And so you're sitting around saying, did it happen yet? No, I'll go a little bit further. But eventually it's going to happen, and each of those increments is, when you go through, you're going to go through, because F is MA, you're going to be accelerated.
Yes, but your stop is already pre-programmed. It'll happen way faster than basing it on your feelings.
Yeah, well, I think, you're describing a system that we just don't have. The human is...
An upgrade.
Well, yeah, the human, first of all, when you give a motor command, you have to move a certain distance. It's probably greater than your robot can control, right? So, I mean, you can't say, oh, I think I'll just do this very, 1 centillionth of a millimeter movement,
well, it's like asking someone to tap and now tap slightly harder and now tap slightly harder.
Yeah, they can do that.
Pretty good at that.
We're good at that. But the other thing is that as people start to go through it, they feel the spring. I mean, they're getting feedback, and so you're basically not just saying a binary, did I go through yet? In which case the signal is this, you've gone through. You're getting this gradual increment of force, and so what you see people is they slow down to a crawl, so they're doing something like you described, right? But when you puncture, sorry, you're thrust, and that's it. John.
Sorry. So obviously a lot of people here are interested in robotic systems, and as Chris was already saying, they're different. Are there any generalizable thoughts you have about what the right way to instrument a robot for force sensing would be if you were wanting to feel tissue, if you were wanting to puncture and not go further? Is the key all in kinematic sensing? Do we need high frequency sensing? Do we just need, is exquisite position sensing all we really need, and the rest of this is just how brains work?
Well, assuming that you can read force, I mean, I'm taking Chris's algorithm, you could say, I'm just going to pre-program a movement of an exceedingly small distance, right? And then each time I'm going to check to see whether force has decreased. If force has decreased instead of increased, I've punctured, right? You might take a long time to do it, but you would never, you basically, since you pre-programmed the movement and it's going to do what it's going to do, I don't know, and if your system is really stiff, that's another part of it, right? So you can just hold it there regardless of the force breaking around it, so it isn't perturbed by the force release, which is another issue, because the person is, obviously, right? But if you have this very, very stiff system, then I think you can just say, yeah, I'll just move it, check, move it, check. So I think that algorithm sounds to me pretty reasonable for the right kind of robot.
Well, if you were going to tell us that we don't need to measure DC force, that a AC measurement, in other words, we just measure transients, we don't really care about the absolute level.
Yeah, yeah.
That would
Yeah.
greatly simplify making force sensors.
I don't think for that task you really need the DC force.
In general.
Oh, not in well, in general, I don't want to go into that. You also have to, you also have to think, you know, what if it encountered a wall? It'd still be trying to go through. I mean, it has to have some kind of priors about what's a plausible force, right? But I actually think I was just saying you could have the derivative of DC force. I mean, I wasn't thinking about, you know, transients, right? Because obviously there will be some perturbation from the membrane, but you could just look at the change in the force, because assuming the membrane is stiff enough, yeah. Yes?
So one of the nice things about the maglev is that there's almost no vibration inherent in the system, but in a lot of robotic systems, there's some degree of internal vibration as a result of the motors or some other part of the system. Obviously, vibration does sometimes mess up human perception, but I guess the real question is, if we're designing a robot to do this type of sensing, you know, for example, if we're directly mimicking humans, that's going to be a problem because we'll be suffering from the same weaknesses. But in a robot sensing design, you know, do we want to turn off certain sensors to dodge that vibration problem in certain situations? Like, do we want to selectively be turning on different sensors in the robot's finger when the robot is encountering vibrations or not encountering vibrations, things like that, at the micro level?
Is there a question here?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, are there lessons we know from human perception where we have failings from vibration that we want to then apply to mimics in the robot's world?
So you started out by talking about other rendering devices that do have vibration. I mean, I think that causes noise. I don't think you could simulate this task very well with another device. Another problem with them is they typically don't have very good stiffness. The maglev is really, you know, a very stiff. So the virtual walls all feel a bit like membranes, you know, under a lot of these haptic devices. And so that answering the first part, I think, you know, these other devices don't work as well. Now with the human, you can't turn off the sensors, or if you do, you pay another price. I mean, because the vibration sensor is also a contact sensor. Speaking of transients, the second that you just brush against any physical surface in the world, if you didn't have those deep receptors, you wouldn't know that you had made contact. So that's, you would pay in some way for not having them.
What I was trying to get at, not very well, but I was trying to get at is along the lines of what John was talking about. I was trying to make a robot system that can feel like a human. The nice thing about a robot system that's trying to feel like a human is we could turn off some of these sensors.
Mm-hmm.
And are there certain advantages where we would want to do that? You know, certain situations where we want to turn off that particular type of you know, human analog sensor.
Well, you can't fool with physics. Think about turning off a vibration sensor that's actually perturbing the position of your robot. You know, there's a strong enough vibration. You don't want to not know about that position perturbation, right? And you might say, well, let's get it from a position sensor rather than a vibration sensor, whatever that would look like, right? And I guess you could do that, but I think having this extra layer of vibration sensing might be something that you really wanted to have. And then a lot then depends on your central processor. You have enough capacity to deal with all of that, then why, you know, you don't have to worry about it. Humans, on the other hand, downgate all the time. So when humans manipulate, they actually downgate somatosensory neurons all through the system, even thermal, believe it or not, get down-regulated when people are manipulating, which means that they don't really want that noise in the system. They say, I'm going this way or that. So it's surprising to think about. But the brain must be realizing there are capacity demands even at that very, very early level. Yeah?
Although if they downgate some of those sensors, which sensors do not get down? Are there any sensors which don't get downgraded during manipulation?
Well, I don't know the answer to that because I don't think people have tested all of them. But to me, one of the surprising ones was to discover the thermal system, because it's a very old evolutionary system that doesn't have a huge amount of regulation. You know, so where is it happening? It's probably happening around the level of S1. And I've seen some new work that basically suggests that S1 is where a lot of this, the signal is allowed to percolate up through the system. Although when you come to touch, so much of this can happen in the spinal cord as well. And there's very complex interneuron interactions and descending pathways. And so in pain, for example, the downregulation definitely occurs in the spinal cord. So, and there are many ways in which you can downregulate. You can pinch yourself here to stop a pain there, and it's remote so that it's certainly not happening at the level of adjacency in the neural structure, but you still are downregulating through some probably there through a spinal loop. Yeah.
So robotics in, let's say, the last decade has turned from a focus on rigid things to soft things. This seemed to be a very rigid-oriented talk. And I'm wondering, how do you feel a dead fish or, you know, slime growing on things?
Well, you know it's dead because it doesn't flop around. I guess that's one thing.
Thermal matters, but you know, how do you sense gooiness?
That would be, I think that's in the rapidly adapting type 1. Certainly slip. There's even a thing called incipient slip, so you can hold your pen, start to release it, and you will know when it's about to drop. And that's because of just that little bit of drag on your fingertip skin. That's soft, actually, but that's enough to set off lots of pings in the RA1 receptor populations. And so I think there are lots of soft interactions, and I think we don't bounce on things, you know. And I kind of also bypass the whole cutaneous cues to softness, but that's also deformation, continuous deformation of the finger pad. So an awful lot goes. In fact, if you had some disease that really caused your finger pad to become quite rigid, you would have enormous problems with sensing and manipulation.
Can I make a comment on that a little bit? Kind of interesting. You can objectively measure friction properties, of course, as well. And the haptic device, for example, the maglev haptic device, is also a robot. You know, it can actuate. And let's say if you put something like shower gel on the handle and move it back and forth, you can measure the stick-slip friction of the shower gel. And that is, in fact, what people did at University of Utah for Colgate Palmolive. They got a lot of money to do that, to evaluate different shower gel using the maglev haptic device, actually. And I got a call the other day from Estee Lauder from New York. They were able to evaluate the friction properties of various perfumes. So it amazes me what you can do with the technology.
Well, there are also all these body cleaning products that have grit put into them to give them a more interesting feel.
So, yeah.
I mean, you know, it can get very arbitrarily complicated.
I don't know. Wait till they discover that Estee Lauder is sending lots of perfume to Ralph.
They just have to buy ours.
Well, that might be a good place to stop because I know our camera person has a limited time. So thank you all.